Good morning, everybody. I wanted to talk about something that's really out of the comfort zone to talk about, but I think it's important because I'm not necessarily making a judgment call on other people's religions, but I just wanted to make a discussion. There's a phenomenon within Christianity, really, called Messianic. They call themselves Messianic Judaism, and you really can't fault them too much, because if there's a reform movement, so there could also of Judaism, which is heretical. Doesn't mean we harbor any personal hatred against people who have fallen into that trap. But if or then they're totally secularists, atheists. They call themselves humanistic Judaism, which I think is much more dangerous and evil than the Messianic Judaism, so-called. Again, no personal hatred, but of course, obviously, that's heretical. It goes without saying, and I feel it's also racist. And these other movements, just general secular Jewish identity, are just basically racism. And so too, we have these various other racist, racialized movements. I don't mean racist necessarily in a hateful way, but in emphasizing race, emphasizing ancestry from a secular standpoint, without any meaning. Yes, in my religion, I believe that someone who is born to a Jewish mother has obligations, the same obligations that someone who chooses to convert to Judaism has, and other people don't have. But that's an article of faith. But just saying that, being born Jewish somehow makes you different or special, well, why? What difference does that make? What is that? If it's not from a standpoint of Torah, again, when I use the term racist, I don't necessarily mean bigoted, but it is still racist. It is still an ideology that's built around race. And if it comes from a secular point of view, often one of victimhood, for the most part. So again, and there are issues with that as well that could be bigoted. It's actually something else I'd like to talk about, but we'll keep it with this. And so that's where there could develop these groups that are Christian theologically, but if you have the humanistic Jews, and they call it humanistic Judaism, not just that they are Jews, but they call it Judaism, which it's not. So we cannot fault the Messianics for calling it Messianic Judaism. We can disagree with them, or we can put all of these groups in the same reform. Conservative is a little different because conservative is a halachic movement. It's not exactly heretical, although there are heretics within the conservative movement, even within their rabbinate. But it's not at its essence a heretical movement. It's at its essence a heteropraxical movement in a certain sense, but not a total repudiation of orthopraxy or of orthodoxy, for that matter. But it is somewhat heterodoxical and practical, nonetheless. But it's much harder to label conservative Judaism as a movement as heretical, as it is to label Reform as heretical. Conservative Judaism is attempting to be that bridge between halacha and what they call modernity. I don't think this term modernity is really an apt term at all. One of my rabbis, Rav Meir Belitsky, Zecher Tzedek Livracha, expressed that it's not an issue of modernity as opposed to Westernism. That's how he expressed it. But when I heard that, I said, well, the East isn't that much better. It's not East versus West. It's the Torah versus everything else, pretty much. But how do we? But just as much, the truth of the matter is not only the modern Orthodox, but even ultra-Orthodox are within the modern world. I don't know any neo-Luddite in the ultra-Orthodox world. I only know of people who maybe say for themselves, they don't need certain technologies and so forth, so they don't use them. But I was talking to someone the other day, a Ben Yeshiva, a Maggid Shir, and I asked him if he, I mentioned to him our Rav, Rabbi Fishman. I asked him, do you look at YouTube at all? And he said no, because I said I have a lot of videos on YouTube. He said, no, I don't need these machines. I said, all right, I need it l'tzorech parnasa. And he said, no, of course. He wasn't arguing against that, and he was, very excited when I told him about our Rav, and he wants to come bring his Talmidim to meet him, Yitzhak Hashem. So anyway, with all that being said, let's move along, away from all that issue. We have this question of, within these groups that call themselves Messianic Jewish, you have many groups with many different views, and then you also have, especially when you talk about the racial ism, you have the Black Hebrew Israelites, which again, there are many different groups among these various communities. In any event, with all that being said, with all these various issues, I wanted to focus on, within what they call the Messianic movements, you have two major groups. You have those who are basically, you really have three major groups, but you have one group that are basically just born-again Christians. Sometimes they're Baptists, sometimes they're non-denominationalists, and they just simply use some Jewish symbolism as a means of attracting Jews to Christianity. But theologically, they're no different than really any other, Protestant evangelical church. And so that form is probably the most deceptive form of Messianic Judaism, because there is no, to call that Judaism, there's really almost no justification for that, because it's really just Christianity with some Jewish accoutrement. And that would be groups like Jews for Jesus, a lot of these other groups. And within that, you have many people who just simply admit that they've converted to Christianity, and they don't use the term Messianic Jew. And I think that's, probably a more appropriate approach. It's just to say, you're not calling yourself a Messianic Jew, you're just calling yourself a Christian, right? That would be the most intellectually honest approach. But then you have, I guess, two other groups, which are really Reconstructionists. Not Reconstructionists in the form of this movement that calls itself Reconstructionist Judaism, which I don't think is really reconstructing anything, sees, again, it's a heretical movement, but it's a curious one. It started out of Orthodoxy directly and believes Judaism as a civilization as opposed to a religion. And it very much comes out of the 1920s, movements of theosophy and all these other movements and Christian Science and all these other movements that popped up at that time, even though it's radically different than those. But the liberalizing approaches to religion that appeared in that time, it's very much a product of that time, even though it's very much changed since then. It comes out as a product of that time. But when I say Reconstructionism, I kind of am thinking of a different type of Reconstructionism that I'm comparing it to as a type of heathen Reconstructionism. Meaning you have certain pagan communities that are trying very strongly to reconstruct things that were at a different time in history. Pre-Christian pagan approaches. So you'll have groups like, Asatru and Theodism, which is essentially a type of Asatru. Different types of, other, Hellenistic paganism and Egyptian paganism, even Canaanite paganism, and all of these attempts to reconstruct a lot of these things that have long gone extinct, mostly because of the church. The church made it a concerted effort to remove these movements. And in a sense, that is what the other two types of Messianic Judaism are. And it's interesting that these both fall into either a Sadducee pool or a Karaite pool, which is much more anachronistic, or a Pharisee pool, which again is, I've discussed before the issue of this term Pharisee. It's a loaded term, but nonetheless, those are the two. So in the next video, I'm going to discuss this a little bit more in depth, why I compare these two, and we'll discuss the Reconstructionist pagans to really the Reconstructionist or Revivalist type of Messianics and Christians and so forth. And we'll talk about that in our next video. Thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment. We'll see you later.